Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you all for coming. We are going to be starting our program very shortly. My name is Atif Mia, and I'm a professor of economics here at Princeton University. We are delighted to have two speakers with us who are going to be speaking on the topic of religious extremism in Pakistan. For those of you who are familiar with Pakistan, the two individuals are very well known as two progressive voices of sanity, I would say, in Pakistan that is sadly lacking these days. We are going to first, the format is first, our first speaker will give his opening remarks, followed by the second speaker, and then we are going to open up for a debate, a question answer, or a discussion rather, between the audience and the speaker, and I will try to moderate that interaction. So that's the plan for tonight. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker. I am really pleased that he is with us today. Raza Rumi, who is sitting on my right. He's a long-time journalist and public policy specialist from Pakistan. He's an editor with the Friday Times Weekly and a senior research fellow at the Jinnah Institute in Islamabad. In addition, Mr. Rumi has been a commentator and a current affairs talk show host in Pakistan and is affiliated with Express TV in Pakistan. Previously, Mr. Rumi worked as an economist and governance specialist for the Asian Development Bank, the government of Pakistan, a number of Pakistani NGOs, and the United Nations mission in Kosovo. Mr. Rumi is an academic advisor to the Network of Asia-Pacific Schools and Institute of Public Administration and Governance, a public policy advisor to Lead Pakistan, a non-profit focused on sustainable development, and he is an advisory board member of both the ASR Resource Center and the South Asian Institute of Women's Studies in Lahore. Mr. Rumi contributes regularly to Pakistani and regional newspapers on topics related to politics, policy and governance, history, as well as South Asian arts and literature. Much of his writing is archived on his website, which is razarumi.com. He is also the author of Delhi by Heart, Impressions of a Pakistani Traveler, published by HarperCollins in 2013. Mr. Rumi holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in social planning, both from London School of Economics. He has also been trained in law and public administration at the Civil Services Academy in Lahore. In March of this year, for his outspoken progressive views against religious extremism, Mr. Rumi survived an assassination attempt that unfortunately killed his driver. Soon after, he left Pakistan and is nowadays undertaking research at the United States Institute of Peace. So with that introduction, I'm absolutely delighted to have Raza Rumi with us, and he will be speaking with us for a few minutes, and then I'll introduce our second speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Atif. First of all, I'd like to thank, it's a matter of great honor and to be here and to be invited by Princeton and of course by Professor Atif Mia, who himself is a very distinguished young rising star, both globally and Pakistani. As a Pakistani, I'm very proud of him. I've been introduced in much detail, so I need not go over what I've been up to. But I would just like to make a very quick addition to what you said, Atif, and that is that Pakistan, unfortunately, has turned into a country where you cannot say certain things and you cannot raise voice against certain injustices and facets of bigotry that have turned into a kind of a norm, a way of life. And whether it has to do with questioning the hold of the orthodoxy, questioning the clerics and the clergy who define much of what Pakistan is now and what Pakistan's identity is, you are either likely to be silenced, worst, attacked, and or killed. And this has, of course, to do with Pakistan's entire history and its evolution. It's a young country, and as we all know, it's separated from the British India in 1947. And it was meant to be a place where the Muslims as a minority in British India would be safeguarded, their economic, their political, and their social rights would be safeguarded. And in 60 years down the road or more, it is now a sort of killer, an attacker of its own minorities. And this whole evolution of a state which is both ironical as well as tragic. Because when Pakistan's demand was being made, the foremost purpose was to ensure that the Muslim minority enjoyed full protection and liberties. And they were not just religious liberties, they were also the idea of sharing power, of being empowered, of participating in national life. And that was what the whole Pakistan movement stood for. There are many views about the Pakistan movement. There were many contradictions in it as well, unfortunately. But once the country was made, its founder, who did mention Islam, who did mention Muslims as a basis for nationhood, gave a very clear direction on August the 11th, 1947, in his maiden speech as the Governor General of a new country. He made it very clear that, yes, we have religious differences with India. We are a separate entity. But now that Pakistan is made, it would be a moderate and plural state. And that Hindus and Muslims, the two big communities of pre-1947 era, would cease to be religious because they would be equal before the state. So the promise or the idea was a secular state. He stopped short of using the term secular for its connotations because the Indian National Congress took upon the secular identity for the Indian state. But it was quite clear that what kind of direction, because he deep down and his advisors realized that if you were to give a religious identity to a state, to institutions of governance, it would spell trouble and disaster. And that is precisely what has befallen Pakistan in 2014, as we speak now. The first departure from that ideal or the policy goal that Mr. Jinnah set came immediately after his death, within a year or so, when the Constituent Assembly passed what is known as the Objectives Resolution. It was a statement of intent. It said, well, we are Muslims and Pakistan is going to have an Islamic character, it's going to be an Islamic state. Fine, there is a religious sentiment and there is a lobby, and there was even then a whole crew of people, parties, groups, interest groups, forces that wanted Pakistan to have an Islamic identity. But gradually over the decades, that piece of that statement of intent has turned into an operative part of the Constitution. Now it is embedded in the Constitution. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into too much into history, but by 73, Pakistan was an Islamic state. And, currently its constitution bars a non-Muslim to become a president or a prime minister. The oaths of office for the highest officials in the country, which are appended to the constitution, mention that sort of allegiance to the Islamic State, to quote-unquote Islam. And the problem with that is that that's all very good and good intentions, but what is Islam, or what is Islamic and what is un-Islamic, is something that has not been settled for the last 1400 years. And even today, Islam, the Muslims are not a monolith. Islam is not one easily definable set of rules or principles or belief systems. So, it varies. There are many sects within Islam, and there are many ways to worship the same God and have practices, and they differ. But within Pakistan, that battle or that struggle has still not been resolved. And so we have today both a sectarian conflict as well as the unresolved question of the Islamic identity of the country. So 73 was that watershed, and then in 74, Mr. Mujib is going to elaborate more on that. That was again a watershed where the parliament took it upon itself to define who is a Muslim and who is not a Muslim. So a whole sect within the Muslims was branded as non-Muslims, excommunicated from what we call in Urdu Daira Islam, or the circle or the fold of Islam. And this is the parliament doing it. Parliament largely comprising secular political parties. The leading or the ruling party was center of the left Socialist Party, and it had secular credentials. But that is the whole irony of Pakistan's evolution into what it is today. And then the 1980s saw another intense phase of institutional re-engineering and restructuring of the Pakistani state and the society along the lines of a particular kind of Islamization project that General Ziaul Haq, the then dictator, and it is worthy to mention, was supported by the US no less, and the West for his role in fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, unleashed a whole brand of Islam in Pakistan. So the laws were changed, from women's rights to what the criminal law would look like, to the law of evidence, even banking system. So it was all Islamicized according to the whim of a military ruler advised by the majority sect, which is the Sunnis, and which excluded the other diverse ranks of Muslims living in Pakistan. And the net effect of that decade, and I don't want to go into too much detail about the kind of laws that were passed, but for example, the law that the Ahmadiyya community cannot call themselves as Muslims, or they cannot even use some of the Muslim references like the simple greeting like salam, or writing Quranic verses on outside their homes, on their graveyards or tombs, was also a crime. I mean, it is surreal. It is from a kind of a dark novel by Kafka or Marquez, where a state chooses to make it punishable that you would use a Quranic verse to identify yourself or to define who you are. And so consequently what we have today, there are hundreds of people languishing in jails, hundreds dying because of this kind of bigotry and intolerance. And that decade also saw the kind of growth of militant organizations, Sunni militant organizations, which also chose upon themselves to declare the other large group of Muslims within Pakistan, the Shiites, as infidels. So you had wall chalkings, you had massive production of religious literature that justified why the Shias were not Muslims or half Muslims or not good enough Muslims or infidels or outright wajibul qatl, liable to be murdered. And that has seeped into that these 3 decades have popularized these narratives, these beliefs. And so you have these militant organizations which have the objective of actually eliminating Shias and Ahmadiyya community from Pakistan to purify the land. So that, Pakistan, by the way, means land of the pure. So it is a bit ironical how it is being played out. after its creation. And so just to give some data from the last 10 years, I think nearly 4,000 Pakistanis have been purely targeted on religious hate crime. I mean, and that is not the much as the conspiracy theorists in Pakistan believe the Jews or the Christians or the Hindus coming in and shooting the Muslims, but it is actually the Muslims shooting other Muslims, thinking they're not good Muslims, or they're not full Muslims, or they're not devout enough Muslims. So you have this kind of a public narrative where a big number, millions, are insecure. And the strategy is very clear, is to actually target those who speak up, those who are the intelligentsia, those who are influential. So for example, the Shia doctors, I think nearly 280 doctors have been killed in less than a decade. And these are targeted killings. They come out of the clinic, or somebody goes in and shoots into a clinic or into a hospital. And these are people who are working for the benefit of the society. I mean, in a similar way, an Ahmadi doctor, a US citizen, who went to volunteer a few months ago in Pakistan, was shot in broad daylight in front of his family and young kids. And such is the fear of the bigotry and the militant networks that the government of Pakistan could not even bring itself to acknowledge that a doctor believing in Ahmadi faith was actually shot down. And at a larger level, it's even more tragic because Pakistan's first Nobel laureate, Dr. Abdul Salam, who was a world-renowned physicist, was disowned by Pakistani state and most of the Pakistanis because he belonged to the Ahmadiyya community. And so, in other words, he was the wrong kind of a Muslim or a wrong kind of a Pakistani. So, resultantly, children in Pakistan who study in schools and colleges don't know who Dr. Salam was. I mean, some know because there's agitation, there's a parallel narrative, there's advocacy, but most of them don't know. And that's a larger symbolic thing because that's the first physicist from the Muslim world itself who was given that recognition, and Pakistan and many of the Muslims have disowned him. So what else could define it better? But this 1980s decade actually laid down the militant or the popular infrastructure, which kind of created the organizations which chose to kill other Pakistanis, but also created an intellectual and educational justification of this quote-unquote purification. So from 1980 onwards, Pakistani textbooks were massively rewritten, where the only kind of Islam that was the Pakistani Islam was a Sunni Islam, where a lot of fabrications, a lot of myths were perpetrated against non-Muslims, primarily against the Hindus, because we did separate from the larger neighbor India, and then we entered into a perennial enmity with India, and Pakistan's drift as a national security state. That's a separate story, but it all sort of came hand in hand. And so children who grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I myself grew up in that era, in schools, I mean, we turned xenophobic. So we thought that non-Muslims were bad, Islam was the best religion, it was only the Muslims could go to heaven. I mean, and these ideas are even violative of what the Quran says. I mean, the Quran says that anyone who believes in and believes in God and is good and does the righteous things will go into heaven. I mean, there are so many clear verses. But we were made to believe that only Muslims will enter heaven, and that to the right kind of Muslims, mind you. And so, and then, all sorts of myths about what the Jews were plotting against the Muslims across the globe, what the Hindus were plotting against the Muslims. I mean, they were drummed into, these 3 generations of Pakistanis have grown up imbibing these lessons of hatred. So today, when an Ahmadi is killed, or a Shia community is targeted, or a Christian church is bombed, often there is not the adequate response because there is a partial kind of justification coming through the popular discourses, through the educational system, through the media narratives, through the kind of popular literature. Pakistan's best-selling Urdu novelist at the moment, whose works run into millions, is someone who also, her first bestseller novel played on the theme where the Ahmadi protagonist of the novel had to convert to redeem him or herself. So, so that's the kind of popular literature that Pakistanis are reading. So that's just to give you a small example. And and Pakistan's other tragedy is also the fact that, we have been embroiled into, in the last 30 years, we've had to deal with 2-decade-long wars in the neighborhood. Now that has unleashed another dynamic. The first war necessitated raising, violent jihadi networks to go and fight in Afghanistan to resist the evil Soviet Empire. And then they were pushed out, but those jihadis did not go back anywhere. They came back to Pakistan. They became part of the society, so they had to be kept busy. So then they went to India to do jihad over there to liberate Kashmir. Then they came back and so they're embedded in the society as well. And then of late, since 9/11, when the second Afghan war started in 2001, Pakistan was again central to that war theatre, and that has its impact because there's migration of population, there's resistance, and which stories that you all read in the international media, and I need not repeat. So it has had its impact as well. There is foreign policy, there is strategic location of Pakistan, the geopolitics playing and feeding into what's happening domestically. The selection of a particular identity, with jihad emerging as a foreign policy tool for the last 30 years. So they have met somewhere and they've turned the society way too violent. And in the last decade, we've seen these attacks on Shias grow. So, another community of Zaras who are also found in Afghanistan, they have been targeted time and again, where hundreds of them have either died in one go, or have been bombed. Their marketplaces, their places of worship have been, razed down. And at the same time, that these groups, because they become so powerful, they can cow down people into submission or into a climate of fear. Then they start targeting other communities as well. So the Christians have also been facing these attacks. There have been 4 major communal attacks in the Punjab province, where at least 100 homes, the last one in Joseph Colony, Lahore, the second largest city, 100 Christian homes were burnt. And there were these young men who were celebrating that. If you see the images, just Google that. And so you will see that a local makeshift church was also burned, and they were burning the cross. And they were making these victory signs. What does that imply? It implies that there is an indoctrinated mind that thinks that doing that to non-Muslims is perhaps an act of worship or a good deed, and so it needs to be celebrated. And that is the mindset that Pakistan has to reverse for its future potential and prospects, because that is going to just divide and induce further chaos into the society. So what is the way out? There are only 2 minutes left. I think the most critical aspect, as I mentioned, is the education system of Pakistan, and much has been written about it, much has been said. Pakistan unfortunately also has a unique distinction of having the second largest school-going population out of school. So 25 million school-going kids are out of school. And those who are in school get a kind of education. That's the kind of catch-22 you have. So there's a whole revamping and reimagining of the education system that has to be done. But more importantly, it is the state of Pakistan, its law enforcement institutions, its institutions of justice that have to, shed this partisan or a sectarian or a religious identity and act as a neutral arbiter of citizen and public interest. And that is what is lacking. So that is perhaps one of the other reasons, Pakistan comes into news for the wrong reasons many times, that the rise in the cases of those accused for blasphemy has also seen a huge increase in the last decade or so. I mean, there are hundreds, there are at least 600 who've been charged, 400 I think are in various prisons, and the judges are afraid to adjudicate on that. The police is afraid to investigate impartially because the other dimension has entered, and that's a mob justice. So now, if a person who is accused of blasphemy or being, anti-Muslim or anti-this or anti-that, can actually be a target of immediate, attack and justice. And the most glaring example was Governor Tasir, who was shot dead by his own police guard, highly trained. It's known as the elite police cadre. And he shot himself. Why? Because he was actually advocating for the rights of a poor Christian woman, accused of blasphemy, and often this is to settle personal scores. And so he was raising voice. He was saying, "Let's amend the law. Let's talk about the law, and let's review the law." And the guard just shot him. And after 3 months, another Christian minister, who was I knew both personally, Shahbaz Bhatti, was gunned down in April because he was heading a parliamentary commission looking into the possibility of reviewing the blasphemy law. There were no recommendations, there was no desire to repeal it. It was just just to explore the idea of making that law more humane or less open to abuse. And he was gunned down. And there's a string of incidents. Lawyers, most recently a lawyer in May, taking up a case of a 27-year-old accused of blasphemy, who was also a Fulbright scholar in the US 2 years ago, was also gunned down in the office. And so now it's also becoming that difficult because the state is both afraid and losing its writ to get law enforced. And I think that, other than the education and its link to the state writ as well, is that Pakistani state has to take stock of its current ability to enforce the laws, the ability to enforce fundamental rights and freedoms. And there is now rethinking. The army has launched a major operation against the Pakistani Taliban, and there has been less incidents of terror, suicide bombings since the last 2 months. But that has to be sustained. It has to come back with the reintegration of these thousands of jihadis who are around in the country. Something has to be done. They have to be given other skills. They have to be given other jobs than just the promise of 72 virgins in heaven. So, otherwise they would keep on blowing themselves or blowing others up or killing enemies. So she has to gain, a blissful life in the paradise. So I think I'll just end there, and then we can go into the Q&A if there's specific clarifications required. But just to conclude, Atif mentioned the attack on me, and I think it's all part of that. I'm neither a Shia, I'm neither an Ahmadi, but the thing is that I speak for their basic rights to exist as citizens of Pakistan. So I was doing that in the broadcast media, and which has a huge reach, and so some organizations thought that I was from the Ahmadi community, some thought I was a Shia, some thought I had converted to Christianity or an agent of the Zionists or the imperialists or the US. So there were all these ideas, and they all culminated in this assassination attempt, which I did not, my name was on various hit lists, but this is the extent of intolerance that, without me, I'm neither a lawmaker, I'm neither a legislator, I'm neither a police, I used to be a civil servant, I quit many years ago, I'm neither an intelligence operative, I'm neither somebody who could do anything, I was just trying to speak up. And I'm glad that I have this opportunity here to continue doing that. Thank you, Anders.
Thank you very much, Raza.